Greetings and welcome to the May edition of our monthly webinar series, How to Value Inclusive Language. My name is Kristen Kolish, a retirement plan advisor at Raymond James. By way of background, I work with employers and employees to navigate their employer-sponsored savings plans. I commonly speak on all sorts of topics, including fiduciary governance, cybersecurity, financial wellness for employees, and investments. But for today's conversation, we're stepping back from the what of the world of HR professionals, aka our HR superheroes, and moving towards the how to consider the value of inclusive language. This topic transcends HR and benefits specific issues and speaks to how we communicate with one another, a skill that is important both in and out of the workplace. I am so happy to be joined by Ryan Sullivan, a Managing Director of Applied Insights with the Hartford Funds. He leads communication workshops around the country and speaks on a variety of financial and practice management topics with a focus on retirement research from the MIT Age Lab. To date, Brian has provided insights to audiences in 46 states as well as Puerto Rico and has led over 1,000 webinars. We are so happy to have him with us today. Ryan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you to Raymond James, and thank you all for joining. Truly thrilled to be sharing some insights today. I think Kristen did a great job setting up the topic. How is it that when we're interacting with others, we can be more inclusive? And I know in leading this event for other groups who are seeking SHRM CE credit, that certainly you folks are ahead of the curve in how to do this, why to do this, but sharing some insights as we go from now having done with this a variety of groups of financial advisors, HR professionals, other plan sponsors, and with insights that we'll share from the MIT Age Lab as well, both Hartford Funds and Raymond James having relationships there that will explain how it's relevant to our conversation. But what we won't try to do is convince you what to think. We're not going to talk politics, but more just looking at inclusive language and how do we help share that with others in a way that it's viewed as an opportunity versus an obligation to help meet people where they are. And so my role in speaking on this, that we all have our work lives. In my personal life, get a lot of opportunities to practice this, actually announce baseball games for young athletes living with disabilities. I volunteer in working with people living with Alzheimer's and dementia and lead workshops for people, single mothers experiencing homelessness. And so I share that only to say that in talking about the subject, I'm not doing that as a teacher. I'm doing that as a student, someone who's always looking for ways to refine how I communicate and connect with others. But as you can see in our time today, we'll talk a bit about why inclusive language is important. Again, I think you're ahead of the curve on that one. Some tips about how all of us can be more aware and intentional about the language we use to be more inclusive. And then last, some tips how we can put it to work for good. And really two meanings there. One, for good, as in making it a habit, and for good of our relationships, our companies, our communities. So if that's useful as a backdrop in terms of what we'll touch on, great. But the why, that I think this quote on the next slide from Helen Henderson. So I'm assuming that when that quote comes up, you folks have seen this before, that on that next slide, she talks about inclusive language, working to the advantage of everyone. We all have things to learn and we all have something to teach. So if we're open-minded to other people's experiences, if we're paying attention, that we can continually learn from others. And we have that ability that I know some people have mixed emotions about terms like influencers, but certainly you folks in your roles are influencers. You can help set the tone, the culture at your companies, and the more all of us use inclusive language, again, an opportunity rather than an obligation. But on the next slide, there is I think, a useful definition of inclusive language. This is from the Linguistic Society of America. They say that inclusive language acknowledges diversity, conveys respect to all people, is sensitive to differences, and promotes equal opportunities. And I think anyone at our respective companies, if you'd asked an employee that, they'd hope their language did that. And yet for all of us, there may be times that even though we're well-intended, the language we're using, what we say or how we say it, unfortunately creates a divide, puts a barrier between us and coworkers. So that idea, you've heard this from Maya Angelou, that when we come to know better, we can do better. Well, how can we come to know better? How can we share that with others? And why does it matter? That the next slide talks a little bit about why to do it. Again, I think you folks are probably very well aware of this, that in using inclusive language, we have the ability to better communicate, better connect with others who may have different backgrounds, and certainly within your employees, your team, friends, family, our centers of influence, our communities. And part of it is just taking that time to learn simple things like someone's name, that, as you folks know, the magic of that when we use someone's name, the name they prefer to be used and pronounced the right way, and in that, the way they prefer it be pronounced. If you haven't seen it, tools like LinkedIn now offering some more flexibility with this, that if companies allow for it. In financial services, we have a bit more regulation about that. Depending on the type of company you work with, that might not be an issue. But the ability to record on LinkedIn your preferred pronunciation of your name. That I hear from folks who say, folks often mispronounce my name or they're not sure how to pronounce it. So that ability for us to record that. And if you haven't seen it, next time you're on LinkedIn, if you're looking at someone's profile, if there looks to be just to the right of that a small speaker icon, if you click on that, again, you can hear their preferred pronunciation. And I think anytime we know that, we feel more confident in interacting, whether it's someone you're interviewing for a potential job, or for larger companies, just too many people to know everyone's name or their preferred name. Again, on LinkedIn, you can now put your first name, but also if you have a nickname that you go by, a separate field for that, as well as pronouns. We'll talk more about that. So that ability for all of us to be more intentional about what we're sharing and observing about others. But as you think about this idea of being more inclusive, the challenge, if you'd agree, as we'll talk about on the next slide, that it seems like society is trying to categorize us more than ever. And so certainly you've heard this term by now, intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989. So a law professor at Columbia and UCLA, but this idea that in all the different ways that we can be categorized, our gender, sexual orientation, our height, our political leanings, that intersectionality, the groupings of that, where especially gender, sexual orientation, race or ethnicity, that those things in combination, that intersection that can essentially have people start at any given situation, in a job situation, in education, where they might have a perceived advantage or a perceived disadvantage. And for us to be aware of what those intersections are, for me, being a heterosexual white male who happens to be tall, I acknowledge that that intersection in ways makes things a bit easier for me. And so that awareness doesn't change anything other than knowing that for all the talk and important talk about things like implicit bias, that not judging people based on where their intersection is, and not pretending I know what it's like to be that person. But if it's helpful to think about those intersections, that because everyone has a different view of how that works in their life and what language they want used regarding that, that in the next section, we'll talk a bit about how is it we can use more inclusive language to meet people where they are. So first, we'll talk just a little bit about the simple framework. The title of the presentation, again, how to value inclusive language. So on that next slide, we'll share an acronym, a simple reminder for all of us that the V in value to validate. Very simply, that if we can acknowledge that people have a different background than we do, then we can learn from them. The A, to ask, not necessarily asking someone a question about their race, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, but more being inquisitive, listening, paying attention. We'll share some of the resources that we use to create this content. Any of us can seek to be more educated, showing that inquisitiveness, that willingness to learn. The L there, to listen, that if we pay attention, very often that folks will use terms that they'd prefer in referencing them or those they care about. So if we pay attention, we can use those as well. The U, to understand. Certainly we all know the importance. There's a lot of research around things like emotional or social IQ, but the last part, to engage, that I've heard from folks in a variety of roles who said, you know, sometimes when I'm nervous about saying the wrong thing in a given situation, I won't say anything at all. And if ultimately we want to better communicate and connect, that comfort that we get to that point where we engaged in a way where it is building relationships, knowing that we still may make mistakes, and we'll talk more about that. So I'll pause there, and folks, I've offered for Kristen, if she wants to chime in at any point with her thoughts or situations she's run into. But if that's helpful as a framework, we'll change gears and talk a bit about how it is we can use more inclusive language.
Sure. And Ryan, actually, if I could interrupt for a moment, we
Please.
did get a couple of questions.
Great.
One was tactical, specific, and one a little bit more general. As it relates to the pronunciation, I think we can all empathize with feeling a little maybe unsteady if we're not exactly sure how to pronounce someone's name. One of our listeners is asking if you know or prefer any apps that help with pronunciation.
It's a great question. So there's a lot of technology out there, but the challenge with that is, for one, people may have their own preference. And if you haven't seen it, I've tested some of this out where, you know, you go on YouTube, pick a word, a name, look up the pronunciation, and you
Mhm.
get individual people who are recording a pronunciation with no way to verify that it's the correct pronunciation.
Great
So,
point.
I don't think there's a perfect way to do it. Again, things like that LinkedIn, the best way I think is hearing from the person themselves. So for folks who they have some recorded social media, to me, always great. I can listen to a clip from a particular author, you name it. But for other folks where they don't have that availability, I think that LinkedIn tool is a great place to start.
Yeah, agreed. That's a great point. I mean, you could Google what apps for pronunciation. They'll give you a list of 10, but it's going to sound like a robot. So I think that's a really good point. And then as we transition into the next section, I do want to acknowledge that, you know, arguably we are speaking today to a very highly engaged group of people, right? If they've chosen to spend an hour of their day learning about inclusive language, for lack of a better phrase, you know, maybe we're preaching to the choir a little bit. So as you continue in your remarks, if you could talk a little bit to this group as to how can they teach their peers who may not be as aware of the importance of the language that's chosen. I have to be full disclosure. Last night, as you mentioned, we're in a very highly regulated industry, right? Finance. And I had continuing ed I had to do. So one of them, and of course it's due soon, I had to listen to a program about being a bystander and listening to how we should be responding if we see a situation at work. And admittedly, it came across as if very, you kind of know what you're supposed to answer, right, with those questions, but it may not be, there's not real life. So how do you taking this content from a webinar we're going to listen to and then answer some questions about, which I promise you don't have to answer any questions today, to making this actionable and practicable in the workplace?
Great point. And certainly I'll work to do that. And Kristen, feel free to chime in if you have thoughts on that as well.
Thank you.
And so with that, this idea of using more inclusive language, I think this is a great quote that sets the stage that words are the clothes thoughts wear. As we know, anytime we speak, it's based on a thought. Maybe one where we've well reasoned not only our intent, but the potential impact on other people. As you folks know, that can be very different. And yet, for that, we still may say things where we create a divide. We say things that aren't well received or hurt people's feelings without our awareness. And we'll talk in a bit about how it is we can seek feedback, what to do if we make a mistake or we perceive someone else feels they've made a mistake. But what we'll do in this next section is just talk through some of the differences. And I think for you all, in being aware that unfortunately there isn't an official guidebook. It would be great if we all could agree on one. That's highly improbable. But to know that when we researched to create this content, we looked at a variety of sources. So as you may know, there are national organizations for Black journalists, for Hispanic journalists, for Asian journalists, the Associated Press, the American Psychological Association, all provide tips, guidelines about how to use language that's more inclusive. Certainly, there are a lot of advocacy groups, everyone from the NAACP, AARP, GLAAD, and others that provide recommendations. Now, many colleges, especially HBCUs, some of them having their own dedicated writing centers, putting out guidelines, summaries, tips, and won't be a surprise to anyone here that sometimes those tips don't quite match up, that there are some different opinions. Add on to that each of us can add our own preference. So as we share some of the language to consider, you may say, or certainly your employees could, hey, that's not the language I use about myself or someone I care about. And of course, how other folks do that is perfectly valid. And then last, there are generational and regional differences. I work a lot with college students, and for at least where I'm interacting in North Carolina, for a lot of those students, it seems like using inclusive language has become more second nature. But for all of our companies, if we're trying to hire people who they're younger, they come from a more diverse background, having it be that not just the hiring manager, but certainly for you folks as HR professionals, but the other people on the team that someone might be working with, helping to provide resources so that people are using language that is more inclusive. Again, we'll provide some tips on that. So as we get into some of the language to consider, to be very clear, as we look on the left there, less inclusive versus more inclusive, that there certainly could be a column on the far left titled Never, Ever, Ever Inclusive. And I think folks are aware of those words. Hopefully they don't use them. But even with that, context matters with these. So I think a great example is referring to a group that isn't just men as you guys. So I've heard from women who have said, Ryan, as a woman, when I address any group, including one that's just all women, I call them you guys. And it's again, it's an example of where what we may think is less inclusive, other folks may feel differently, and vice versa. So for me, in presenting to groups, often speaking to groups of, in my role, female financial advisors, that I, living in the Carolinas, can use phrases like you all or folks. Thank you, folks, for being here. So to me, it's just an example of a small phrase, but one that I've had some women say, you know what, I'm not a guy. I don't want to be referred to that way as part of a group. So that type of awareness, not that there's a right or wrong, but if we can defer or default to being more inclusive, that can help people feel more part of a group. The next couple of rows, reminders, are roles in, especially our country in the past, that were more often filled by men, now by people of other genders. Sometimes the language hasn't quite caught up. So being more aware of that, I had an HR professional at my company who said she's working really hard. She keeps using the word manpower, and she just catches herself and says, that's, I think part the awareness. So catching ourselves and then seeking another alternative. But those last couple of rows need a bit more context. So using people's preferred name. So my wife happens to be an infectious disease doctor here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we live. Imagine my wife at a table with a group of male doctors, and as they're talking, they're saying to each other, well, what do you think, Dr. Johnson? What do you think, Dr. Smith? What do you think, Katie? And my wife, who isn't one for formalities, had to speak up and say, if we're all using doctor, I'm a doctor. Unfortunate, but she felt in that moment it was the right thing to do. And for her description, folks did much better with it from then. But the last one, you've probably seen the research that says that people interpret leadership traits differently in people of different genders. That for women, in being assertive, that sometimes being described as bossy. At the same time, we're a man exhibiting that same trait, a leader, a take charge kind of person. So the research looking at how that reflects on things like job reviews, performance evaluations, the potential for increases or higher level of managerial responsibility. So just making folks aware of that bias, that instead of having that be gender, just looking at the traits exhibited and judging people based on that. So we'll go through some different subjects. Again, the reality, we could go deeper with any of these, but just trying to touch on some of the high level things where we can make for a better example, certainly review any of our training material to, and there's some tools now out there to help you with that. If you haven't seen it, Microsoft Word and others have the ability, you can scan for things like less than inclusive language. In PowerPoint, that there's a feature, if you're practicing a presentation you're going to give to the company, that if you type in the following 3 words, rehearse with coach, rehearse with coach, you hit enter, that puts you into presentation mode like we're using today. But at the end of it, you get a private personalized report that, amongst other things, lets you know if you use language that isn't as inclusive. The same, very similar in Microsoft Teams, a feature called Speaker Coach. So for us, especially for you folks in your role where you're setting that example, just how do we get objective feedback ourselves, where folks might be tempted not to offer that, some of those tools may be useful.
Ryan, if you see me jotting down, I didn't know that. Rehearse with coach. I am taking that away. That's 3 words I will remember after this afternoon's discussion. And as you were speaking, I had an instance this morning. I was on a client call with a vendor. So we have a mutual client. And I intend to reach out to the vendor. She did a great job with the content, but that phrase, you guys, I couldn't unhear. Like once you're aware of it, and I'm just going to bring it to her attention, I may given I knew what I was doing this afternoon, I was very aware of the language that I was hearing. But I do think a big part of this has nothing to do with intent. It's just awareness and how much of something is conscious versus unconscious. My guess, and I'd be interested in your feedback, most of this is unconscious.
It seems that way. Unfortunately, there are people who intend to slight others, and that's
Sure,
a
very
reality.
fair.
But I do think there's a lot of people who they just haven't given it enough thought to be intentional. So the nice thing about some of those software tools like Rehearse with Coach, that it's objective. We don't need to ask someone. We're just getting that as a report, and to see it in writing. All right, maybe I need to work on that one.
It's great.
All right, so folks, as we switch gears, so we were just talking about gender-oriented language, now sexual orientation. It seems most folks are familiar with that acronym on the top right. So LGBTQ, so lesbian, gay, bi or bisexual, trans or transgender. The Q, as you may know, can have multiple meanings, including queer or questioning. But I've had folks ask about that word queer, that isn't that an insult? And to me, a great example of a word being reclaimed, taken back by a community to reduce the negative associations with that. But some of the those next two rows, just reminders. And again, you all know, but if we can encourage that for the hiring managers at our company, the frontline folks who are interacting with staff, not to assume that someone they're interacting with has a spouse of another gender or parents of different genders, that those simple things as reminders go a long way. And many companies going back, reviewing things like their guidebook, their HR policies, just for references of things like gay or same-sex marriage, that now that it's legal in all 50 states, that many folks saying, well, why not just call it marriage? The last one, that idea of sexual preference versus orientation. I heard someone on a webinar we did, she said, I think about it like Lady Gaga and her famous song, Born That Way, that if our goal is to meet people where they are, that the idea that sexual preference is a choice versus sexual orientation, the more we use that language to meet people where they are, the better. But with that, I think often there's some confusion between this topic and the topic on the following slide, which gets more into gender identification. And I know for a lot of companies doing things like updating systems, forms for people who have different pronouns, some people still a bit confused by that. Again, this is something that people can put in their LinkedIn profile, what their preference is. Many companies allowing employees to put it into their email signature. But this idea of what if we don't know someone's preferred pronouns, or we're talking about a group that, this idea of they, I've had a few folks ask, hey, is that proper English? Well, I was surprised in researching it that there's examples of that going back centuries in our country, but also that officially approved for that use by Merriam-Webster and others in 2016. So how to use that if we were to say, we have someone coming in for an interview at 3, they will check in at the front desk. That simple way, and then once we find out their preferred pronouns, we can use those. I think for some of these, you'll get the point. I think the one thing to encourage, so we do a lot in my company, what are called courageous conversations. I'm sure for many companies out there, just having groups of employees talk to each other, learn about different mindsets, people's experiences, but sometimes in seeing terms that are new to them. So words like cisgender, so someone who is not transgender, often shortened to just cis, CIS, that an example of a word where if we're not exactly sure what it is, what it means, how to use it, that right back to that value framework, we can look up, learn more about it. GLAAD and others have very detailed reference guides, or we can just listen for people we're interacting with. How do they use it? So I think sometimes this feeling of pressure that we're supposed to, as soon as there's a word that's different, incorporate it. obviously we want to learn more about it, use it the right way. The last one, confusion from some folks on what it means to be trans, that this idea of, their birth certificate and what their gender identification is, that if those two things are different, so if someone's birth certificate says male, they identify as female, that would be a trans or transgender woman or just a woman, if we're trying to meet people where they are. So again, I think for professionals like yourself, where this, it's how do we share it with others? I think in part how we use it being that example, but reviewing where possible company guidelines, pointing people to references. There's a lot of great ones we can share. Diversity style guides, another one. Nope. Conscious style guide. Diversity style guide's a different one, but conscious style guide.com, another great one of just where to start if you're looking for resources. But so as we go to the next topic, talking about race and ethnicity, again, terms like BIPOC, standing for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, that, again, if we're not sure how to use that, I hear folks who say, I'm so unsure whether to refer to someone as being African American or a Black person. And so I don't say either. And of course, how people choose to identify themselves is completely valid. It does seem, you folks might agree, that the trend is going more towards a member of the Black community, and hearing from many folks, even at my company, who say that they trace multiple generations of their family to countries on continents other than Africa. And so a Black person or a member of the Black community. But for all that, there is change, consternation. You might be caught up in the discussion about how do we refer to someone who doesn't have a pronounced or identified gender or a group. So Latina or Latino, as you folks know, those are gendered words. So one word that seems to be getting a lot of pushback from across the political spectrum, the word Latinx or Latinx, in part that just X isn't a natural part of the Spanish language. So one word I'm hearing more often, seeing it more on things like government forms, Latine or Latine, where we'll see if that gets used more by that community. But I think another great example where we can listen, pay attention before we go changing all the forms, the systems again. Those last couple, so I think anytime we refer to someone solely as a race, ethnicity, you name it, that's being less inclusive. But an Asian American person, I think for folks who don't realize, there are 48 countries that are under the umbrella of what's considered Asia. So an Asian American person, or obviously a member of the AAPI, so Asian American Pacific Islander community. We'll pause there. I don't know if we have any questions, or Kristen, anything you'd add before we move on to the next section?
I don't see any questions here, but one of the items that comes to mind when how the word minority has changed over time. And I'm actually getting ready to speak at SHRM 24, a financial wellness workshop for women, and how women, depending on the environment that you were in, had been use that word minority to represent. Do you have thoughts on that? I mean, there are so many categories that we put ourselves in. I don't identify myself just as a female, for instance.
Yeah, I think that the word minority, part of the thinking in redefining that minority, the word minor, that if it's a smaller group, that their rights, privileges, experience doesn't matter as much, versus when you put together many groups who are less represented in aggregate, that's a majority. So I think the more that we look at that, the folks with, yes, they have different backgrounds, but they have enough of a unique experience that it's different than what would folks would say is a majority. I think it does, to your point, it gets right back to that idea of the different ways we can identify ourselves that society does. And so, to me, looking at more of the language on the right that seems to be more common and how people tend to be representing or discussing their own community, their own race or culture, that to me is where the trend seems to be going.
Well said. I do have a question here. Please tell us how speaking of quote unquote Black person is inclusive and not racist.
Well, so is there race or ethnicity involved in that? Part of it is looking at, is a descriptor necessary?
Right. What's the
Like,
context, right? What's the context of the conversation?
exactly. In hearing folks say things like, oh, I had friends, I had lunch with my gay friend Steve, or I went to dinner with my Black friend Susan. How about just your friend Susan? That is a qualifier necessary. So, I think in part just in people wanting to, and you look at what's going on in the Black community, the Latina community, where people, they want to talk more about a shared identity. And when it comes to everything from, we're not getting to politics, but voting rights, how things are reflected in culture. So, is there a camp out there that says we should ignore any differences between people's color, race, ethnicity? I personally think that's very difficult to do and ultimately doesn't allow us to address real systemic issues in keeping that as, imagining it's a homogenous world. That's as far as we'll go. You can stick around for part two where we'll get into politics, not on this call. But hopefully that's helpful. I think in especially listening to how folks describe their culture, their community, that to me is where hearing what folks are using, and then for me, not just respecting them by using their preferred language.
And then there is one other question before we move on about if there will be a discussion about different belief systems, Christianity, religion, how that gets factored in.
That we don't have it as a slide, and just the reality that here we are, we're getting towards the majority of our allotted time and we have a lot more slides to go. So to me, it's an important one, especially some of the conflicts going on around the world. It's not a focus in this presentation. We just had to limit the discussion somewhere. But again, some great resources. There is now a new section. I mentioned this conscious style guide that gets you to how can people have conversations, people with different religious, philosophical beliefs. Adam Grant's done some great work on this, that in part, instead of each of us just spouting our belief, that the more we listen to each other, the better that we're able to find commonalities, common ground. It isn't easy. There's a lot going on, but I think that's a great place to start.
Terrific.
All right, so folks, on the next section, talking about age and experience, that a lot of folks in the workforce in the US being affected by ageism. And really, as you know, there's two sides to it, people who are being perceived as too old, and for a lot of people newer to the workforce as too young. And with that, a lot of implied connotations that somehow if you're a boomer, that you are too set in your ways. If you're a millennial or Gen Z, that you have to love avocado toast. I'm Gen X and I love avocado toast.
I'm
So
with you.
instead of asking any one person to represent a multi-million person demographic, a lot of these, as you know, these generations are 20 years or more, expecting that someone at the beginning and end of that have very similar values is a stretch. But instead, if we just refer to people as individuals, or instead of, I hear this a lot, newbie, someone new to a team, to a company, versus a fresh influence. But the one we get the most questions about is that second to last row, retiree. I mentioned we have a relationship with the MIT Age Lab, that referring to someone as just a retiree is not an insult per se, that as the head of the Age Lab would say, it's not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. You think about it, that we're solely referring to someone based on something they no longer do, they no longer work. So instead, to help them fill in that gap, a retired person who is very involved in their faith-based organization, is the world's best grandparent, is a constant volunteer for important causes, that can really help people, because as much as, at least in financial services, we help to make sure people have enough to live on, that for all of us, helping our current workers, our retirees, make sure they have enough to live for. That sense of meaning, purpose, belonging, very important. But the last subject we'll touch on briefly before getting into some related tips is health and disability. So here, important to note that distinction between person first and identity first language. So some people believing that there are some disabilities people live with that are so integral to how you work with them that they need to be mentioned first. So I do a lot of work with athletes with disabilities, many of the parents saying they have an autistic child, and in that being identity first language, others using person first language, so a person with autism. Whatever folks use with them, those they care about, of course, valid. Seems like the trend's going more towards person first language. But the other reminders here is we just think about the language being used, that how it is that folks may be more likely to use resources if we tweak how we talk about them. A great example is handicapped parking versus accessible parking. Very few people want handicap parking. Many people have a need and want accessible parking. Or I have a brother who spent most of his life using a wheelchair. He hated when people said he was confined to a wheelchair. His wheelchair was his freedom. So just being aware of that, again, providing employees resources that if they want to learn more about this, language to help them see that distinction. But folks, in the interest of the time, let's jump into some of the tips. And here, a great quote you've probably heard of. Verne Myers was the head of diversity, equity, inclusion at Netflix, has now left, created her own company. But this quote, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion's being asked to dance. It's one thing to have a diverse workforce. It's another one to get their input, have them providing valuable insights, feedback, helping to shape everything from, if it's benefits being offered, cultural celebrations being celebrated at the company. But the next slide talks about tips to get started. You folks are way ahead of the curve. So let's say tips to refine or tips to help share with others. We talked about whether a qualifier is necessary. If we don't need to mention someone's race, sexual orientation, why bother? But that next one, I hear from folks who after a talk like this say, well, I get it. I'll be more politically correct. And for some of them admitting, I'll just say less. And if the whole point is for us to build a stronger workforce, build more understanding and trust, that instead of being just focused on being politically correct, seeing it as an opportunity to personally connect, that changing that mindset, obligation versus opportunity. But what if we get feedback that we've done something that's less than inclusive? I would love to tell you that the first time that happened, this was years ago, that I said, thank you so much. What I did was try to explain it away. Oh, I think you might have misunderstood me. See, what I meant was, and now what I've learned, if someone provides that feedback, to thank them. Because if one person is thinking it, there might be many. And to say thank you, I'm really going to give that some thought. And what I find once I get away from the situation, I can be a bit more objective. I often find that there is at least some truth in what they're sharing, that I can tweak what I'm doing to be more inclusive. The last one, this idea of a platinum rule. Many cultures, religions have a version of a golden rule to treat others the way we want to be treated. This idea of a platinum rule to treat others the way they want to be treated. How do we know that? Right back to that value framework, paying attention, the language they use, etc. But the next slide gets into the reality that we will make mistakes. If we're having these conversations, if we're trying to refine what we're doing, the probability at some point, I'll say at least I'll make a mistake. But a great quote, I haven't found a good attribution for this yet, but that the most sincere apology is changed behavior. The most sincere apology is changed behavior. If I get feedback that I did something wrong, if I actively try to do it different next time, I think that's a great indicator to the folks we're interacting with, employees, colleagues, that we are sorry. The guidelines change. If we did this talk 5 years ago, the language would be different. That'll be, again, different in 5 years. But I think we're making progress with this. That Toni Morrison, as you know, the author, Nobel Prize winner, said definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. And what if that changes a bit? We have more say about how people speak about us and people in our community. Our language has history, so words like grandfathered. We use this in financial services a lot to discuss someone who has an exemption granted. But as some of you know, that word, some historians have traced its lineage to laws largely intended to lessen the impact or ability of Black people to vote after the Civil War. So can we just say an exception or exemption is granted? The last one, I hear folks who say, well, I get nervous and then I joke. The problem, many people on the receiving end of racism, sexual harassment, that, oh, I was kidding, lighten up. I think this is a great test that anytime someone goes to tell a joke, if the joke starts like this, where they look around to see if anyone might be offended, when in doubt, leave it out. So the last things, quick recap, why to do this again. You folks are aware, but I think sharing where possible the research that indicates if there's more diversity, equity, inclusion, especially at higher levels of management in companies, that often there's a correlation to better performance over time, better culture, more likelihood that folks stay with the company. You all know the costs of having to replace people who have left. The last one, not talking politics, but if social media has convinced us that we're more disparate, separated than ever, maybe there's a chance that language can help, and that ultimately inclusive language can lead to more inclusive action. But with that, the next slide, just a quick recap, and then I'll turn it over. I know, Kristen, there was a couple of things you wanted to touch on.
Yes, thanks so much, Ryan. As you're speaking, I'm also thinking about, so a lot of the attendees today are SHRM members. A great example of this, allowing ourselves, when we know better, we do better. SHRM, even as an organization, used to host a conference that was entitled the DEI Conference, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. Well, it's now just called the Inclusion Conference. Like, why focus on what makes us different? Let's focus on what brings us together. So I think a takeaway is that words matter. And oftentimes it is not what you say, but what the person hears, and how you're making them feel. So I am going to transition for a minute because, yes, while the context of Ryan's conversation could be applied to every aspect of our lives, workplace and outside, I'm going to take a minute and talk about how words you use in your benefits program matter, and repositioning perhaps your existing benefits to resonate with what's relevant to your employees is so very important, speaking in terms that they understand. A great example is even just the transformation. There's a mantra in the financial services industry: retire the word retirement. Because the word retire, if you look it up in the dictionary, one definition is to withdraw.
So who wants to get excited about saving for a time where we're withdrawing from society? That's not exciting. What could be empowering is this sense of financial independence. And there's many surveys and studies that show the language we use when we talk about leveraging a 401k, a 403b, or a pension matters. And if you're just positioning those plans, and I am guilty of this, I'll talk about it as the retirement industry or a retirement plan, you're excluding those employees where retirement's not their number one goal. And that's actually doing yourself and your benefits, which are probably better than your employees appreciate, a disservice. I'll give a couple other quick tidbits, and then hopefully we'll give you a couple minutes back in your day. But as we think about 401k, 403b plans, I referenced at the beginning that I work with employers on their sponsored savings plans. So yes, you might be using that 401k or that HSA for expenses in retirement, but it's really more about using the benefits to further yourself along on your personal financial journey. I think it's interesting that when surveyed, workers take the phrase investment risk and just associate that with high risk. There is no qualifier in front of investment risk. There is a such thing as low investment risk, but when you talk about risk, that people think that that's high. I think actually, if I'm throwing darts, so to speak, I think the financial services industry has not done a great job on the retirement front. All the advertisements are of going on grandiose vacations, and we're hanging out at the beach, and it's all about your retirement is a dream vacation, when in fact, for one, that's not a realistic goal, and for two, that may not be something that resonates with folks. You want to be comfortable, you want to maintain your lifestyle, you want to be confident that you're not going to run out of money. I am guilty of this, and I'll tell you, in the last 2 months, I'm working with my team to change the vernacular that we use with clients. The idea that, I'll give you an example, a 401k plan, you're contributing every paycheck. Well, the investment jargon is you are dollar cost averaging into the market. Well, yeah, I have finance degrees, and to me, that's a great thing. But to the average person, dollar cost averaging means nothing. So let's speak in terms that someone understands. How about automatic monthly investments, regular monthly investments? Even something as simple as referring to a stock as equities and bonds as fixed income. Well, stocks and bonds tend to be the preferred language when you're talking about investments. We talk about having a target asset allocation. Well, how about let's talk about not necessarily the feature, but the benefit. Why do you want an asset allocation? Because it's diversified. So these are just examples of being very deliberate and thoughtful in the words that you're using. To me, both these phrases I prefer over retirement, but financial security actually has been showed to be that resonates a little better than financial freedom. All interesting when we think about how we position our benefits. So it is 54 minutes after the top of the hour. I'm going to wrap up by thanking Ryan. What terrific insights. I hope this has given you some great information that you can reflect on personally and that you can bring back to your organization. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm sure a lot of what we've discussed you appreciate as HR professionals, and I hope that it's helpful in bringing it back to your employees so that you can put this work for the greater good. If anyone happens to be at SHRM 24, our team is going to be in Chicago, the Raymond James team representing SHRM 401k Solutions by Raymond James. Stop by our booth. We got a lot of fun stuff planned. It's going to be a terrific event. And as always, be on the lookout for our monthly programming for other topics of interest. So with that, I wish you a great rest of the week. And thanks for joining us. And thanks, Ryan. Thank you again.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks all. Take care.
Take care.